So you're new to riding and you're ready to buy your first bike. And you suck mechanically, or you're like me, you just hate doing that sort of stuff. So what should you do? First, learn to ride. Take your MSF or your local equivalent, get your license, make sure this is something you really want to do. A lot of people will buy a bike before they even know they want to ride. If you're like me, you're going to do a bunch of research. So what should you be looking out for? First, reliability is absolutely everything. You want to be riding. Secondly, you want to buy something that's in your limits, something you can ride today without being frightened and have confidence on, but still have a little bit of room for you to learn and learn new things over the first year of your bike's knowledge. Third, understand this is not a forever decision. You can swap your bike out pretty easily. And fourth, you're going to want to look for a mechanic locally who's going to be able to service your bike. So all those things you don't want to do, you have someone who can do them for you. And that can be surprisingly hard to find sometimes. As you're inexperienced at buying bikes, you're going to want to buy as new and as low mileage as possible. In fact, this might be the only time I ever recommend anyone buy from a dealer. Now, to buy from a dealer for your first bike is probably going to cost you between $7,000 and $8,000. So it's expensive, but there's a lot to be said about a bike with a full warranty and no known problems. If new isn't for you, then used bikes it is. However, when you buy used bikes, they come with someone else's problems. So that's why you want to make sure you're buying something as recent as possible with as few miles as possible. The great news is that there's lots of bikes like that out there for sale generally. There's always bikes people are selling because they decided they didn't want to ride anymore, it wasn't for them. Or they're upgrading to their next bike. When you do budget for a used bike, however, make sure you're budgeting about $1,000 to do anything that needs to be done to the bike to make that roadworthy. For example, the first thing I do when I get a bike is take it to my mechanic, and he will flush all the fluids, he will check over the bike completely. It doesn't matter how many times people say, oh yeah, I changed the oil. You don't know that. When buying used, watching Fortnine's video, 5 Telltale Sides of a Bad Used Motorcycle, absolutely required. And when you do go out, if you have a friend who knows about bikes, or at least even looks like he knows about bikes, take them along with you. One last piece of advice, don't finance a bike. Bikes tend to be luxury items. There's really no need. If you don't have the money to buy the bike, wait until you've saved up. Financing generally turns out to be a bad idea. If the deal looks too good, it's too good. This is not an area you want to be like doing it cheap. This is your life we're talking about. You're on 2 wheels out there with all the 4-wheel people. Make sure you're buying a bike that you know is safe. Great deals that look too good to be true, they just are. All right, so we've established a budget. What are we going to spend it on? Well, as I said earlier, we're going to look at reliability. And reliability in motorbikes tend towards Japanese bikes. They're absolutely bulletproof. They've been around for years and years and years. Parts are everywhere. So you really want to think Japanese. The other great thing about Japanese bike being bulletproof is it's very likely your first bike is going to end up on the ground sometime. And Japanese bikes, for the most part, just don't care. Most of my family learned to ride on this Kawasaki Vulcan S. And it was also my daughter's and my wife at the moment's #1 bike. It's been in multiple low speed and no speed accidents. It's been on the ground quite a bit. And quite frankly, when you look over it, unless you look really, really closely, you couldn't tell. I've done nothing to this bike since I've owned it, except for regular maintenance, change the tires, change the oils. Okay, this is going to be unpopular. Do not buy a Harley for your first bike. I know a lot of you got into biking because you wanted to buy a Harley. In fact, some of you probably already have bought a Harley. The reality is Harleys are expensive, they don't rate well on reliability, and for some reason they're unnecessarily complicated when it comes to fixing. I love a good Harley. My next bike may well be a Harley. However, don't do it for your first bike. Also, as we talked about earlier, as a new rider, you don't need to be riding 1,000cc liter bikes or $40,000 Harleys. You want something that's really going to be in your range of capabilities. So what should we buy? Well, let's break this up into 2 sections. One, what 80 to 90% of you should be looking at for your first bike. And then a second section for those of you who absolutely must have a sports bike for their first bike. I understand that as well. For most new riders, we should be looking closely at something like this Kawasaki Vulcan S. It's about 7K new out the dealer door, and you can buy used ones for 4 or 5K that are only 2 or 3 years old. It's massively adjustable. My wife's 5 foot tall. She fits on this bike perfectly well. We did make the pegs a little bit shorter, but I can also fit on this bike, and I ride this bike quite regularly at 6'3". It's a great bike, nice and controllable, really approachable, doesn't weigh a whole lot. Ninja 650 engine that Kawasaki's detuned to be more of a cruiser type, so at low revs it really is a really easy ride, and you've got room to move. If you get up into the power band at about 5,500–6,000 revs, it really does take off like a Ninja. So great bike to be learning on, lots of room for you to get better at. If you look at the dash has nothing on it, to be quite frank. You got a speedometer, you have a tach, you have a fuel gauge and a gear indicator. Nothing more that you need for a new rider to get started in. This isn't your only choice, though a great one. You could also be looking at a Honda Rebel 300 or 500. Both, again, really excellent bikes. Are going to meet all the criteria in terms of price and features. And also, Kawasaki's actually coming out with an Eliminator Cruiser, which is very similar to this, a little bit smaller. Certainly something worth looking at if you're getting into the beginner bikes. For those riders that are bigger, maybe the Vulcan S may feel a little small for you. I suggest going up to a Vulcan 900. This is my Vulcan 900. It's again very approachable. It is a little heavier than the Vulcan S. It even has less on the dial. You don't even get a tach on this. Basically, this is just a speedometer and a fuel gauge. But it's a great bike. Not going to get any trouble on it, but you're certainly going to learn a lot from riding it around. For your sport bike riders, I understand you want a sports bike, but don't buy a liter bike, 1000cc, 750. Your first sports bike should either be a Yamaha R3 or a Kawasaki Ninja 300 or 400. And I know some of you are going, oh, that's too small a bike for me. That's just not true. These bikes fit me. I'm a much bigger rider, and they're huge amounts of fun to ride. You'll learn a lot more on a Ninja 300 or 400 than you ever will on a much larger bike in terms of riding. And you can take them down to the track. Lots of people are racing these around on the track days and having a huge amount of fun and learning about riding fast. You'll hear a friend of yours go, oh, I learned on 1000, but the reality is you can always give those things too much throttle, and power's not a substitute for learning to ride properly. So buy yourself a nice Yamaha R3 or a Ninja 300 or 400. My daughter has an R3. I love riding that thing. The other great thing about owning bikes is whatever your first bike is, even if you feel like you've made a mistake, it's not going to be that big a deal. The great thing about bikes is they don't lose value as fast as other things like cars do. So when you buy a bike, if you want to change it out to something else, the financials of that are about $1,000 plus the differences between the value of the two bikes you're looking at. I have friends who change bikes literally every year. And if you're not getting $1,000 worth of fun out of your bike, you're just doing it wrong. So don't worry about it. Buy a bike, enjoy it, and then if you want to, you can swap it out after 6 months or a year if you feel that you want to ride something else or try a different type of riding. As I said, look, I want you to have a bike that is free of problems, one that you're going to be riding all the time, but that doesn't excuse you from everything. There are two things you absolutely should have. You should have a proper inflator for your tires, and you should have a battery tender. Bike tires lose air quickly, and you only have 2 of them, so you have less rubber on the road. So it's more critical than it is with cars to make sure that your tires are correctly inflated. I actually check every bike I own at least once every 2 weeks. Having a battery tender is also important because there will be times where you can't ride. For example, we had 2 weeks of rain. My bike's just sat there. Some of my bikes are on older batteries. I just connect the tender up, make sure that bike's ready to go. And of course, if you do lose battery power, having a tender is going to help you get that bike back on the road real quickly without having to worry about it. So let's summarize. Buy new or buy as close to new as you possibly can. Buy reliable. That probably means Japanese bikes. Remember, this isn't a forever decision. Okay? We're going to be able to change bikes if we need to. And lastly, make sure you get yourself a good inflator and a good battery tender to make sure the small things that you really should do for yourself, you're doing for yourself. And with that, my Vulcan's right here. I'm going for a ride.